Morning, kids. This is going to be a more relaxed format, which I'm going to try and put out on Sundays, because a lot of stuff gets lost during the week. For example, in the Tory leadership race, it got whittled down to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. Boris Johnson gave his final PMQs, ending it off with "Hasta la vista, baby," and despite having to leave office for supporting a sexual predator, he got a standing ovation. Add to that a whole load of chaos around Brexit, but I want to focus on this self-revelatory article that he put out in the Sunday Express, celebrating his 3 years in office.
When I became Prime Minister 3 years ago today, the British people were despairing of a deadlocked Parliament, a paralysed government, and a political system that appeared rigged against vast swathes of the country.
Why is that? Is it because somebody campaigned to give Parliament the job of having to turn a 4-word referendum mandate of leave the European Union into a 1,000-page international treaty that somehow matched the wishes of 17.4 million people? A job which you objectively failed because the 52% weren't just represented by Conservatives. The DUP rejected your Brexit deal within minutes, and Nigel Farage, representing the Brexit Party, said,
"A second referendum on the deal, which no one understands, and staying in the EU." I can see it as clearly.
And do you know what, Colin? Colin, Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time.
We had 3 years of political chaos with Remainers fighting Brexiteers and Brexiteers fighting each other because of you. You weren't the saviour, you were the cause.
The task before me was very clear: to break the logjam and get Brexit done, so that we could get on with the vital task of levelling up the United Kingdom, and that's what I did.
Within 6 months of that election, Boris Johnson called his own Brexit deal unfair and vowed to renegotiate it. A deal that he'd spent 3 years saying would be the will of the people. A deal that he presented to the people in that election as oven ready. An election where your manifesto explicitly promised no more renegotiations, and yet that's exactly what you're doing now. Which means that when you then go on to say,
hitting the reset button on Parliament by winning the biggest Conservative majority for a generation,
he's admitted to delivering the biggest parliamentary majority in a lifetime based on a lie that is now obvious to everybody. So congratulations on destroying trust in politics.
We took back control of our money.
Again, he's going back to his propaganda from 2016. We all remember his claim that we pay £350 million a week to the EU, which was actually closer to 192 million when you include what we get paid back directly. But Boris Johnson insisted that it was okay to use the bigger figure because it was all money that we didn't control. Well, now his government's own figures show that Brexit is costing 4% of our national wealth long term. And yes, that includes the money we're no longer paying for EU membership. And it's been calculated that it's already cost us £31 billion since we left. And this week, the exit bill for our leftover membership commitments jumped up by 10 billion to over 15 billion euros, despite them previously calling that project fear.
It doesn't seem likely that there will be such a bill for £50 billion. It's part of Project Fear.
Suffice to say, we now objectively control less of what would have been our money than we did before.
We took back control of our borders.
You think we're in control of our borders right now? Have you seen Dover? Did you see the 5 miles of queues of British citizens struggling to get out of the country, in large part due to the extra passport checks the French authorities now have to do because we're no longer EU citizens? And us begging France to fix it despite them already hiring hundreds of extra staff to deal with our decision. As with so much of the Brexit rhetoric around taking back control, I find myself thinking of Bane.
Do you feel in charge?
But to be fair, that's the border going out. How about checks on things coming in?
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with.
So you're deliberately not controlling the border because your right-hand Slenderman says it would be an act of self-harm.
Installed a points-based system for immigration.
Great. How's that working out for the farmers who've had to burn well over 40,000 pigs because we haven't got the EU butchers anymore to turn them into food? Or how's it working out for the thousands of holidaymakers who've had their flights cancelled because the airlines couldn't hire enough EU staff? Or how did it work out during a pandemic where our main weakness was a lack of NHS staff? You all remember that the economy kept having to be shut down because it looked like the NHS might get overwhelmed, largely due to staff shortages. Well, there was a 90% drop in EU nursing applications since 2016.
We took back control of our laws.
If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Better question. If you take back control on paper, but on that same piece of paper you sign a deal that says that if we change our laws in any way that gives us an unfair competitive advantage over EU businesses, then the UK will face crippling tariffs. So you're so scared of changing our laws that the hardcore Brexiteers have been complaining for over a year, and Jacob Rees-Mogg had to beg Sun readers to tell him which laws to change. Have you really taken back control?
And we took back the sovereign right of the British people to determine their own future in Parliament.
Did you? Because it looks like he put in photo ID requirements for voting, despite having no evidence of significant voter fraud, knowing that it might be the extra barrier that keeps 2 million of the most marginalised people in society from voting. But I suppose those aren't the people you want determining our future in Parliament.
The Romaniacs, the Ramoners, the Rejoiners, they didn't like it then, they don't like it now.
Thanks for reminding us that you're still the toxic little rat that broke British society by branding people as traitors for simply being scared of a Brexit that your own government said would make us poorer in every single scenario, and which now your government is saying has done more long-term damage to our economy than the pandemic. People who choose to stand between their country and that kind of damage should not be called moaners and maniacs. They're called the heroes of history, whether they're successful or not. But you poisoned British society by implying that anybody who didn't want that damage was betraying the people.
You don't have to look hard to spot them, some quietly plotting in dark corners of Westminster.
Almost every poll since 2018 shows that the majority of people now oppose Brexit, and we're not plotting quietly in dark corners of Westminster. We'll be stood outside the Westminster Parliament on the 10th of September, shouting loudly for a better future at the top of our bloody lungs.
Others spewing hashtags across social media as they sneer at the readers of the Sunday Express and the millions of Brits with whom they disagree.
You just called the millions of Brits who oppose your Brexit moaners and maniacs, and now you're condemning those who, quote, sneer at the millions of Brits with whom they disagree. What?
Still more camped outside Downing Street, bellowing through microphones at bemused tourists and long-suffering police officers.
The people of the UK are suffering the sharpest fall in living standards since the 1950s and the highest rate of inflation among advanced economies. And you've cut universal credit, raised national insurance, repeatedly refused to feed their kids, broke the law during lockdown, then laughed in the faces of people who had to watch their loved ones die over Zoom, with 200,000 dead. And then the MPs responsible for all that took a £2,200 pay rise in April. Any day where there's only a couple of microphones outside Parliament, you should count as a fucking blessing. But even that's apparently too much for you, which is why you passed the Policing Act, which your own Parliament's Human Rights Committee says violates our right to protest, and your Home Office says will discriminate against black people and travellers.
But the British people put their faith in me to get the job done.
No. 44% of 2019 voters put their faith in your party. The majority voted for the exact opposite agenda.
And time again, we got the big calls right.
The initial Parliament inquiry found that your early response to the pandemic was one of the worst public health failures in UK history, costing about 20,000 avoidable deaths.
Does that count as a big call? We've invested in our children's future, giving schools their biggest financial boost for a decade.
Well, for starters, your party, the Tories, were still in power 10 years ago, so saying that it's the best for a decade is like giving yourself a gold sticker for personal improvement. Secondly, your education czar quit because you refused to provide the funding to help poor kids catch up after lockdown. You also tried to use an algorithm to take the best predicted grades from state school kids and give them to private school kids.
We've invested in our precious National Health Service with a record-breaking increase in funding and around 30,000 extra nurses recruited.
But those nurses are burning out and leaving the NHS in droves because after you oh so graciously gave them a few claps for saving your life and the lives of countless others, you told them they had to start paying for parking again at their own hospitals and have effectively cut their pay.
A virus, the origins of which we still do not fully understand, the spread of which was appallingly difficult to manage.
Difficult to manage? Managing a pandemic requires three things. It needs people to listen to experts, it needs people to follow more or less the same rules that other countries are following, and it means limiting people's freedoms to keep their loved ones safe. So why might Boris Johnson have found that difficult? The pandemic really started hitting us in February 2020, just as we left the EU. So what had he been saying for the previous 4 years? He'd been telling the public, we're British, so we don't need to listen to experts. We're British, so we can scrap all the stupid rules that other countries are following. We're British, so we can pursue unlimited freedom, and it will be
win for all of us.
And he immediately applied that attitude to COVID.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
On the same day that his experts told people not to, and after the UK was found to have suffered the highest excess death rate in Europe during the first wave, he said,
there is an important difference between our country and many other countries around the world, and that is our country is a freedom-loving country, Mr. Speaker. And it is very difficult to ask the British population uniformly to obey guidelines in the way that it is necessary.
So he didn't impose the early lockdown and strict mask rules which we needed because he was still too hung up on his Brexit ideology, and people died in their thousands. Boris Johnson clearly has no intention of staying quiet. He's going to keep putting out stuff like this, celebrating himself, making harmful and divisive statements like the tabloid hack he's always been. The benefit of that is that he's going to be a constant reminder of the kind of politics that every single Tory MP supported for 3 years while our country and our people were at their most vulnerable. Because everybody knew what Boris Johnson was when he took office in 2019. I remember how beautiful it was seeing thousands of young people take to the streets in protest against him. We know that the Tories know what he is, but now they know that we know that they know. Never mind. Have a good week.